Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We are meeting today for the AICA Roundtable concerning institutional changes in Central Europe after 1989. This is the third roundtable in the series of events supported very generously by the Visegrad Fund within a grant project that is going to lead to the publication of an English language anthology of critical essays from the region. And this panel discussion is going to take around 1.5 hours. You can expect 3 to 4 rounds of questions, and I would very much like to let all the people who joined the participants today a warm welcome to all of you. I would like everyone to be able to ask a question or add a comment to what our wonderful guests will be saying today. And my name is Arkadiusz Półtorak. I am the president of AICA Poland, and I will moderate this discussion with 4 wonderful participants. Representing AICA Czech Republic is Barbora Kundracikova, art historian and curator, the head of modern art collections at the Museum of Art Olomouc, Central European Forum, assistant professor of art history at the Palacki University in Olomouc, and last but not least, a prolific writer and editor of art-related publications. Representing AICA Slovakia is Omar Mirza, curator and critic, the curator of collections of graphics and photography and other media at the Nitra Gallery in Nitra, the vice president of AICA Slovakia, and as I've heard, also a radio host. Welcome. Representing AICA Poland is Dorota Mąkiewicz, art historian, curator and critic, the former director of the Contemporary Art Museum in Wrocław, former president of AICA Poland, and also a prolific organizer of survey shows presenting Polish modern and contemporary art with shows at Kunsthalle Baden-Baden or Ludwig Museum in Budapest in her portfolio. And last but definitely not least, representing AICA Hungary is Zsolt Petrányi, art historian and curator, who has worked at many prestigious institutions in Hungary and beyond. Since 2005 until 2011, he was the director of Kunsthalle Budapest, and henceforth he has worked as the head of the contemporary collection at the Hungarian National Gallery. He has also taught art management at the International Business School in Budapest. Thank you very much for joining us, and warm welcome. To give a few words of introduction to the actual roundtable. While discussing the scope of this discussion with my colleagues, I suggested that we start with a rather wide, open set of questions concerning the legacy of the institutions that formed in our region before 1989, as well as the social and cultural contexts that defined the post-1989 transformations within the cultural sector in the region. And this dual frame of reference, it appears useful for at least one significant reason. During the previous roundtable in this series led by Maria Chlawajova, the participants discussed the local aesthetic, cultural, and institutional traditions from the vantage point of post-colonial and decolonial theories and practices. They showed the relevance of Central and Eastern European artistic and intellectual contributions within a globally significant discussion. And a closely related debate now concerns the possibility of an immanent critique and undoing of modernization modeled upon the Western ideals, economies, and institutional infrastructures. It is this very debate that we will attempt to, maybe in a mediated way, join today. As noted by the Croatian philosopher Boris Buden, the transition from real socialism to the capitalism and liberal democracy in the Central and Eastern Europe has often been described as a rather linear and, in fact, deterministic process, as the proper fulfillment of modern ideals and institutional modernization, as opposed to this kind of pre-1989, you could say maybe failed modernity, right? So it was a passage from a failed modernity to, so to speak, the modernity proper. The institutional transformations in the cultural sector in our region have also been described sometimes in a rather similar manner. This kind of perspective, however, blurs the conflicts of values that defined the paths of cultural transformation in the region, and the long duration, the longue durée of certain social and cultural issues and traditions in our respective countries. And this is why we'll try to show today, hopefully, the subject matter at hand from a very localized and situated perspective. Thanks to AICA International for hosting this discussion today. Thank you to Visegrad Fund. And without further ado, let's start the discussion. Let's start talking. And as anticipated a minute ago, I would like to start with a question, or a set of questions actually, concerning the difficult legacy or inheritance of the pre-1989 social and political reality. What did the dynamic of decentralization in your country look like? What was the perspective assumed by the lawmakers and people who defined the pathway of post-1989 modernization in the cultural sector? What was their attitude towards the infrastructures that were there at hand in the beginning of the 90s, inherited from the previous time, which of course attracted maybe ambiguous responses and evaluations. And maybe I'll direct this question first to Barbora, if you don't mind.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for the introduction, also for the invitation. I'm really not sure if I'm the right person to answer this question as first, but I'll try to do it somehow. And you'll see how it's going to work. And then we can reestablish the position, I guess, because I was thinking, my thinking is much more in a general level. And I actually read a few articles covering the scene and the exhibition which were presented at the beginning of 90s. And one of them was actually called Between Aesop and Mowgli. And I think this kind of trying to find a new language and new approach to the situation was the main topic actually for all of the people in the beginning of 90s working in the political but also in the institutional field. I think for the Czech Republic still is a common base that the structure of institutions stay the same at the beginning of the 90s. Actually, the institution which really operated in the region, also in Prague, stay the same. I mean, the structure of the national institution, which meant in the beginning of 90s, two institutions, National Gallery and Moravian Gallery in Brno. Very quickly, the third gallery occurred, and it's Olomouc Museum of Art, and this triple of institutions still works in the field. But there is a net of let's say regional galleries operating in the regional centers, regional cities, like Plzeň, Liberec, for example, Ostrava, and so on. And from these, because the structure really stayed the same, very quickly re-established their position, regional centers, which operated during the 90s and which are still very much important. Although I don't think that the process of decentralization really happened, because I think they are still, somehow connected with Prague, and the Prague is still the main center, still operating in the art world in the Czech Republic right now. And these two centers were in Ústí nad Labem, which mean western borders, and on the other hand, in Ostrava, in eastern borders, which is quite symbolic, I think. I won't speak about Slovakia. I think it's a specific case, and it's for Omar to reply for this, although we shared this 3-4 years in the beginning of the 90s together. I think the story is very similar in some level. But yes, these two centers in eastern and western borders were the most important right from the beginning of 90s. It means for the institution of the type of a gallery or a museum of art. What's quite interesting with school system, actually, still the main academies or art schools were operating in Prague. It means Academy of Fine Arts and the School of Applied Arts. And the third school, but it wasn't a university, it wasn't the academy, it was just a faculty, was established in 1993 in Brno, actually. So this was another triple system which somehow covered the education in arts. I think it's very important to say that the first half of 19th century is strongly different against the second half of 1990s, but I think we are going to talk about it more later. So this is just some basic points from me for now.
So I would suggest we immediately engage Omar in the discussion and address the elephant in the room, so to speak, that already appeared. So the repercussions of the split of Czechoslovakia into two from the Slovakian perspective.
Yeah, so it's interesting that in the first 3 years of the 90s, or actually like the first 3 years after 1989, or the 2 years actually, we were still a common or a joint state, Czechoslovakia, and we also shared to some degree the processes or the institutional processes, or they were very similar. And in Slovakia, especially the first 2 years of the 90s, 1990 until 1992, this was a period where things were moving and in a relative progress, and also concerning the National Gallery and the development there. The elections in 1992, they kind of stopped this progress, and the political system just for 6 years until 1998 happened to be in a way that was not very how to say not very considerate or very acceptance to progressive tendencies in art institutions, especially also in visual art, but all the other institutions, and especially also the political situation wasn't very optimistic. And Slovakia was, with the words of Madeleine Albright, a black hole in Europe, and also like started to be politically on the brink of authoritarian regime, something that happened in Belarus. But the institutions, the transformations, just it really, the state-run institutions didn't transform, or the transformation wasn't finished, because it happened to be like in the first 2 years, as I said. But then the political system and political influence was very strong within the institutions. And also, like Barbara said, the whole scene, not only art, visual arts, but the whole cultural scene was very centralistic. Bratislava, the capital, was the main place where things were going on, and you had a quite wide web of regional institutions, but only few of them had program that was really relevant. But still, you had some institutions that, especially in the 90s, were developing programs that were, so to say, progressive, like in Trnava, the synagogue in Trnava, or Žilina in the northern part of Slovakia, and also as Barbara said, the school system or the art academies. We had the art academy and the Academy of Fine Arts and Design in Bratislava, and only in 1998, if I'm not mistaken, in 1997 there was established the Academy of Arts in Banská Bystrica, in 1998 in Košice. So the last years of the 90s, and the change of the regime, the change in the political system happened that or provided the opportunity to catch on with the changes that started in the first years of the 90s. So if we have to somehow compare us with the Czech Republic, with which we shared a common history for many decades, and also the transformation process maybe started in a similar way, we had this recess, this rupture in the process in the 90s, which was later caught on upon in the last years of the 90s, and especially in the first decade of the 2000s.
Thank you. I saw Barbara getting agitated, and so I give way to
I am actually. Thank you very much. It's just a short comment, because I think this connection between Czech and Slovakia actually somehow worked, right, also during 90s. And if I mentioned Ústí, it would be very important to mention also Košice, because this connection, again, between border cities somehow on the east and on the west worked also in this period. But it was much more about personal connections than institutional connections, I think, at the time. That was it. Thank you very much.
I'm wondering which border. I'm sorry, but please, everyone who is not speaking right now, please mute the microphones. There will be time later to add comments or questions. Thank you very much. Let's move now maybe a bit to the south and look into the Hungarian perspectives. I already noticed some common points between the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland, but let's leave that until the end.
I just want to open up a little bit this description of the institutional changes, because in Hungary the basic situation was in the communist times that there was one organization which was called Fine Art Fund. And this foundation had 4 different role to fulfill for the artists. One was social, to give a social help. The second was to form an artist union. The third was to help the artists regarding law. And the fourth was to organize exhibitions. And what is interesting that when we had the political changes and all the structure have changed, the new or the renewed artist association, which was called, like, if I translate, Hungarian Association of, or the Association of Hungarian Artists, took over these basic roles. And I think that speaking about the heritages and speaking about what went through and what did not, I think that this is a very interesting issue, how the artists define themselves in our societies, and if that have changed or not. Because in our case, I would underline that even in the circles of the young artists, the beginning of the 90s did not show big changes. And of course, Hungary is one of the smallest countries among us. And in that sense, centralization or decentralization doesn't make that much of sense. Decentralization meant that after the big artist organization, many smaller organizations had been founded, which were always related to the media, like organization of graphic artists, organization of watercolor artists, organization of sculptures, etc., etc. And during the 90s, it turned out that this kind of separation of a big organization doesn't make sense. But the key point was not this. The key point was, in our case, the properties. What happens with the studios, which were used by the artists in a very social way? What will happen with the summer residencies and summer camps, which were on the countryside for residency programs? Who will own them? Who will run them? Who will support them? And what will be the role of the state? And during the 90s and later on, when different crises went through, I think that the deconstruction of our organizational system was based on these financial problems as well. So in that sense, I think that the behavior of the artists have not changed that much, even the organizational frames have changed. One of the interesting point was the story of the Young Artist Studio Association, which was a side organization of this big artist fund from 58, because in the 90s, the Young Artist Studio Association wanted to renew its working model in many sense. So one of the things is that they formed a new legal how can I say, description, and they wanted to change the yearly program of the association. And one of the changes was looking like if it would be anti-democratic. And I think to introduce this word democracy and anti-democracy is very interesting, because democracy in our countries have a political aspect, but in the artistic field that means different. Because I think in all of the countries that the yearly exhibitions of these organizations were the same. I mean, all of the artists could apply. We had big kind of Kunsthalle-like institutions. Every artist could send one work or two works. There was a jury. Most of the artists were accepted. They were exhibiting the works. They made the booklet, and that's it. But when the Young Artist Studio Association changed its program for the first time in the mid-90s, telling that, okay, we are done with this democratic exhibition making, and we would like to introduce curators to select the artist, that nearly made an uprising among the artists, because they felt that this is absolutely an anti-democratic process which is going on. So I just interrupt myself. Just we will continue as we will, but just to leave some minutes or leave the panel or whatever, to give the possibility for an answer for Dorothea also.
We will come back to the question of democracy a bit later, and what's the status of an artist in a democratic society, as discussed by the Central and Eastern European artists and critics. We've been talking artist unions, the significance of smaller institutions, political stagnation. That sounds close to home, doesn't it, Dorota?
There were so many issues undertaken by by the speakers who spoke before me that I really don't know what to stick to, but I will stick to the material I prepared, I think, because there was the question of decentralization, and there was a question of democracy, and the question of prolongating the situation from before 1989. In Poland, we had, as I seen it now, we had quite developed the institutional system before 1989. But it was a strong hierarchy because there was the central office of art exhibitions, Zachęta. Everybody knows this Kunsthalle in Warsaw. And there were the local galleries, which were in many cities in Poland, but they were how to say, they were joined with, they were included in the structure. That Zachęta was on the, Warsaw was on the top of the structure, and all these were branch, let's say, branch galleries of Zachęta in many cities in Poland, bigger and smaller. All these galleries were mostly created after 1956, especially in the beginning of 60s because of the thaw. I mean, when the social realism was over in Poland, the interest in the contemporary art was extremely high in the second half of the 50s and in the beginning of the 60s. And when where the 1989 came and our elections in June, and then the structure started, the political system started to change in Poland, this Zachęta still remained in this situation until 1993. Of course, the program totally changed. Mostly the program of Zachęta was to summarize what happened in the 80s in Poland in the independent galleries. So all these underground, let's say, galleries started to show the activities in the 80s in Zachęta. It was the beginning of the 90s. A big survey through the independent art, dissident art of the 80s. There was another factor or another hero of the scene. It was the CCA, Center of Contemporary Art, Zamek Ujazdowski, which was created 1985. But until the end of the 80s, there was no much exciting program in this institution, mostly because of the political reasons, because mostly the actors of the art scene in the 80s, they were not eager to exhibit either in Zachęta or in CCA. Both were state official institutions. And still they were not much sexy for the real art scene, for the artists, especially young. And after 1989, art was not in the focus of the political change. I mean, there were, for the authorities, for the state government, there were much more important matters to solve than to care about art. So in 1994, there was a change. 1994. That these local galleries, which were subordinated to Zachęta, the state get rid of them. Means that they were not run or financed by the state anymore, by the Minister of Culture. They were gave away to the local authorities and to the regional budgets and so on. It caused a crisis in these institutions because the financing, of course, by the smaller budgets of the cities, this financing was not enough. And this is the beginning of the change in the institutional structure in Poland. Decentralization, short observations. Because all these small galleries, this BWA, this BWA galleries all over Poland were not mighty, then the CCA, there was a change of the director, and the Wojtek Krukowski became the director of CCA, and the CCA became like a central producing institution for art. I mean, the artists were producing their works. The CCA was helping them and supporting them, and the most important first exhibitions, premiere of the young artists happened in the CCA. So it was very much centralized, and it was caused by the budget simply. In 1998, two young art critics and very soon galleries of Raster magazine and Raster Gallery, they published something which was called the integrated circuit of Polish art scene. And this integrated circuit they expected that it will be connected with the chip, with the electronic means. So it was, I cannot translate it properly, but it was quite funny name for this. But they gave us a summary of the situation in Poland. Where are the important galleries? Who is subordinated to whom? Where are the most important exhibitions? Which institution plays the prominent role on this art scene? But all this, it was really quite funny material because they commented it in a very ironic way. But all this was leading, this material was leading to the conclusion that everything is centralized, and if the artists want to be seen, must exhibit in Warsaw and especially in Zachęta or in CCA. Maybe one more thing, because this is the discussion, there was also a discussion of quality. Quality meant modern art, not conservative, but progressive. And there was a triangle in the first half of the 90s between Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, Zachęta Art Gallery, and Foksal Gallery in Warsaw. These were three institutions which were cooperating very closely and giving the level of the art in Poland. And on the other side, there was CCA, which is alternative, progressive, young art program. So that is for the beginning.
Thank you, Dorota. And now I would like to, well, actually return to the issue that was already touched upon by Zsolt, which is the status of art and artistic institutions within a supposedly, at least, democratic country or a democratic society. Actually, all of you have touched upon this thematic already to a smaller or larger extent, but so far we've been focusing on the discussions within the art field, and maybe I'd like to kind of redirect this conversation a little bit to a different place. What was the reception of art and artistic institutions after 1989, at the time of transition within the so-called civic society? Were these changes in the cultural sector recognized in any way by social movements, non-governmental organizations, or actually politicians themselves that sort of agitated the social and political life at the time? How do you feel about it from also today's perspective? And maybe let's go to Zsolt, since he kind of anticipated this question.
I just would like to give an introduction about this topic, and maybe it will, in this first some sentences, I will not answer the question, because I think that the democracy and the question of democracy is not rooted on it's rooted on a personal level and not, or ideological level, and not on an institutional level. It's very interesting that in Hungary, until, and of course in every country of ours, until 89, there is two big group of artists. One group are supported by the state, the others are not supported by the state. In the 80s in Hungary, and of course in all of your countries, the non-supported artists were kind of underground artists. The supported ones were the ones who were teaching in the art academy and have different positions. And when we had the political changes after this moment, these two groups, both of them became totally unsure from that point of view, that the ones who were supported became totally fragile because they felt immediately that they have an ideological weakness, namely that they were part of the socialist regime. And the other ones who were not supported and who were joining the underground lost the stage of the underground. Because in Hungary, the underground artists were the cool artists, always. And from the 90s, there were no any meaning of that. I mean, who is underground and who is not underground? And during the first years, this unsureness resulted to very interesting projects in one sense. But going over a little bit to the institutional part, it's interesting that the two, instead of these two categories, two new categories arose or came up. And one was the international artists, or the ones who are interested on the international scene, for example, because they spoke any of the foreign languages, like German or English, so they could communicate with curators. And on the other side, we had artists whose national feelings or connections with local folkloric or whatever ethnographic tradition became stronger. And because of this, in Hungary, for example, in '92, two Hungarian art academies had been formulated. The one was integrated in the Hungarian Scientific Academy, and as a section of that, a group of artists established their own circle there, and absolutely independently from this, another academy has also been established, which was called Hungarian Artist Academy, which was a bit more conservative. There was the artist who, for example, like Imre Makovec, who was a very famous architect of the time, and who had a stronger connection with the Hungarian folkloric tradition. And this dichotomy, or this double institutional system, I think caused further problems. And here's the point where I close my introduction and give the floor to the others.
I would maybe ask one more auxiliary question, because it seems to me that creating two art academies at the same time required a certain amount of political will and executive power. And my question would be, how did the artists from these two groups actually made it happen? How did they lead towards these investments?
I think that in Hungary, one of the most dramatic problem was that the change of the political system was very smooth, and historians used to say that it was unfinished in a way. So from one point of view, there were artists or intellectuals who accepted the new system as it is, with its problems, and there were others who were not 100% satisfied with what went on. And I think that was one of the reasons why groups had been divided, or the artist circles had been divided. We don't, from a personal point of view, we don't remember to that time as a very nice and very comfortable time. This is the time where, as we used to say, when families have split, just because of who voted for who. So in that sense, this kind of separation of a country to two different groups or angles or parties or whatever started in that decade. And in this kind of institutional problems, you can see it. But we have to say that the academy, which was formulated within the Hungarian Scientific Academy, had some budget, and the other one didn't have any budget. So from that point of view, this separation is rather ideological. Yeah.
Thank you, Zsolt. And I see Omar is ready to join.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Zsolt and talk about this dichotomy in Slovakia, because it's interesting that we share some points and some things are different. So we also, before 1989, we had this we called it unofficial scene and official scene, like the official artists who could exhibit in the institutions, and the unofficial artists, the so-called unofficial or underground artists, they only could exhibit like at their own apartments or in some spaces that were not officially meant to exhibit, like galleries and so on. But it was interesting that also these artists from the unofficial circles, they could manage to get institutional funding or state funding for art in architecture or art in how do you say it, like every time when there was a public building built, a school, a hospital, or a apartment block or something, there had to be a certain amount or a certain percentage of the money invested was supposed to be put in a work of art. So the architects worked closely with artists, and the artists created some statues, reliefs, fountains, and so on. But not only the official ones, but also those who were not supported officially from the state could get these opportunities, and could also live out from these public I forgot the word, anyway, yeah, from this
Investments, I guess.
Investments, yes, investments. So this was an interesting thing in Slovakia, that many artists that after the revolution came into prominence and were supported, and we had to catch up, so to say, just to make these artists that were unofficial, to show them, and there were a lot of exhibitions and a lot of things, a lot of publications about these artists, and but still these artists weren't like dissidents, all of them, because they really kind of could kind of live parallel lives, and of course many of these artists had to teach and so on. But this is the situation that after 1898 this changed for both of these groups, that the official and unofficial artists just didn't have this opportunity for public commissions anymore, because there were no big investments in building of any kinds like this. So then it's interesting that that this turned upside down, that the once official artists were unofficial, to say, so they couldn't exhibit anymore, or they didn't exhibit in the National Gallery or in progressive institutions. But both of the artists from these groups, they didn't have an opportunity to have these public commissions. That means to support their life out of finances from the state. So their existence was really difficult, and many of them had to teach and so on. But this dichotomy didn't really change, because since then and now also these two groups live, to say, or function parallel to each other. You have this group of artists that are, let's say, more progressive or international, or oriented towards trends that are international, and then you have artists which are more traditional and more conservative, but still they have institutional background. There are institutions who exhibit their works, who support their works, parallel to institutions that focus mainly on the more progressive artists. And what is also important concerning the money or the art market is that the taste of people who in the 90s especially made big money out of privatization of public companies and so on, that their taste is tending more towards the traditionalist artists and also toward modernism and the first half of the 20th century. So this is a paradox that these artists, which are more conservative and traditional, can maybe find more collectors than the artists who are more progressive, because of the taste of the people who, this was especially in the 90s and maybe in the beginning of the 2000s, that the taste wasn't very progressive, to say. Now it's changing. Now you can see that also institutionally there are young artists or internationally oriented artists being collected. But this is what happened with these two groups, which I wanted to add to Zsolt, that how they changed, and also that the group of these more traditional artists were even more visible in the society because they kind of had a better self-promotion or better PR, because they were on TV shows and so on. Like so the general taste was formed more by them than by conceptual, post-conceptual artists, international art influences, which is we have to be frank to ourselves, more complicated for people to understand than if you have some nice pictures of flowers and sunsets.
I would love to actually hear what these TV shows were about, and did they touch upon issues of democracy? But in the meantime, I give way to Barbora.
Actually, I must say I already forget the original question, but there are so many issues. If you would like to repeat it, do it. Otherwise, I would
Absolutely.
react to
I asked about the factors and the agents that were shaping the discussion surrounding the status of the artist in a democratic society or a civic society.
Okay.
So were there institutions that led the way? Did artists themselves maybe have a lot to say about it? Or maybe there were also politicians or media engaged in the process? This is an open question, and I realize that, but I want to frame the discussion so you can actually lead us from your internal perspective.
Okay, if I follow my internal perspective, I would go to this kind of a generational shift, actually, and also to the word of postmodernism somehow, because I think it's a quite important factor on a Czech scene. We have this, unofficial scene, which was mentioned many times, and I think it's quite universal in Central Europe and Eastern Europe in the context of totalitarian era. So I don't want to describe it anymore. But this kind of unofficial scene, I mean, people around 50, 60 years old, at the end of 80s or beginning of 90s, professors of the Academy of Fine Arts, which was reestablished in that time. This was the generation which was somehow, reflected by the institution I've mentioned before, and it's quite logical, right? They needed a space, they needed a place to be presented now because they weren't established in their active years, let's say. So I think this is something which goes for this official scene and official institution, state-funded institution, and so on. But on the other hand, this huge energy, which was connected not just with their entrance into the scene and into the art world, but also I think they were a little bit afraid of the system and the global world and so on, because it was very hard and very quick, all these changes, market issues and so on. It would be very nice to talk about it more, I guess. There is one group, for example, which is called Retarded, right? And these are classical painters, mostly professors at the Academy of Fine Arts and so on, but people who actually were somehow, at least in their thinking, behind Zenit, I mean, in the active years and so on. But on the other hand, and this is the point, I would like to mention the generation which is connected with group like Stubborn-Headed, Tvrdohlaví, or Monday, Pondělí, which really brings something different, a different shift, which are, I mean, these groups interested in Western art and try to reestablish the Czech scene on this kind of models. And I don't want to open the question between or about the relationship between East and West, but this kind of interest in the Western culture. And on the other hand, not to be interested in Eastern culture, to be connected with, for example, Russian unofficial scene, which was very much interesting for the Kaupecký's generation and previous theoreticians' generation and so on. This is also something which is very interesting for me. And I was talking before about the official scene, regional institution, national institution. On the other hand, there is a group of institutions which are established newly, of course. First Kunsthalle in Prague, Rudolfinum opens in 1994, and I think it's a very strong push for the scene. Very important is also the office of the president, Václav Havel, because they organized a lot of exhibitions which somehow try to reestablish the scene, and which were very important. But if I would, or if I should mention one very important aspect, is this kind of a generational move, which is very strong and which is also connected with, the word curator and reestablishing of the position of curator in this spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbora. I give way to Dorota, who has also been a vital participant in movement and a movement leading to the creation of Modern Art Museum in Warsaw, which was a movement with a certain leverage, political leverage, you could say, I guess.
But the history of the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, it's later. It's the history of the 21st century, so I would not speak about this. I was listening to all of you, and the first observation I have is that in Poland, after 1989, we didn't have this differentiation or this division between the official artists and the dissident artists. In fact, we had this division between art critics, the ones who were the ones who in the 80s were supporting the dissident movements, and they were very conservative, politically, political opposition, and at the same moment, a very traditional conservative thinking about art. On the other hand, we had the new art critics who start in the beginning of the 90s and who are mostly connected with the idea of the open society. We also did not feel, for me it's important to underline this, we did not feel, we did not have the division between international artists and the local artists. Rather, we we were sad that the resources on the west side, let's say, are much bigger than the resources of the east side. I mean, we mostly saw the difference in terms of financing art and art institutions and artists, of course. Because artists were completely neglected in this new liberal system, which appeared after 1989. And somebody mentioned about the artist studios and who is the owner. Rod noticed this. Who was the owner of the artist studios? So in Poland, simply because there was the Society of Artists, of course, in Poland as well. And in the previous era, this society was supporting artists with receiving the studios, for which they were paying very little money. And when this new capital system came, then it occurred that the artists will not have these tax reductions for having the studio, and they have to pay the full rent for them. And then it occurred that many of them cannot afford it. So the studio, which were built during the communist era, were transformed into the regular flats for rent. That many studios disappeared in this way, and artists were complaining a lot. But to give a coda to this, that we now observe the rise of this artist union, which tries to have the political influence on the art scene, and it is not it has nothing to do with democracy. This I would say in short. Yeah, I mean that our present government supports the artist union, and this is a political connection based on the same ideas, political ideas. The artist union and the government. And in this artist union, there are no young artists. It is a very closed situation. I mean, they do not develop, but they gain a power now. So I think I reacted to some situations you were telling about. And how we observe the artist institutions from outside, not from the point of view of the artist, but from the society. The society was mostly indifferent towards the art institutions, and especially in comparison with the present moment, where there are so many visitors in the art institutions. In those times, the art institutions looked very dusty, very conservative, and not interesting for the public and for the visitors. So nobody cared how this institution, what is their situation, if they can develop or not. There was not a problem between the artists, but it was a problem between the liberal economic politics and art. And it must have passed a lot of time that nearly we had to enter the 21st century when the government noticed that there is art and art is important. This is what I wanted to say now.
Thank you, Dorota. And Zsolt wants to respond, I see.
Not respond, I just would like to connect to the comment of Omar, because I'm just asking you if we can go, for example, to make a turn to the direction of financing and supporting in this period. Is it interesting for you? Can we do that? Can I comment on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it was very interesting to hear about the taste and to hear about the beginning of the art market. And in Hungary, it's interesting that we had one very trivial reason why the modernism and this kind of a turn of the century Hungarian artists became very popular in the first auctions, which were organized in the 90s. And one of the thing was that there was a gossip, and the gossip was that the currency, that the forint, which was given to as a price for this classical artist, pressed down the prices very much. And when the first years of the 90s and the economic boom will lead to the boom of the prices of the classical Hungarian artworks, because they were kind of devalued somehow, or how can I say? And so many new rich people have invested to these classical art pieces, and it was for them, it was not a question of taste, because it was a question of the names. So if there was an artist who was absolutely accepted from the point of view of the art history, so you had to buy one artwork. And as one investor told to me, for them, it was absolutely guaranteed that within 5 years, you cannot double, but you can make like 10 times more value of the same painting, which was much better than any kind of other investment. Nothing could get this kind of profit what art could bring. This is one side, because this is interesting, because it's like a bubble. It's like an economic fact that this was one side where these new rich people have invested to art, but it was not touching the active artistic scene. The active artistic scene in Hungary, and I absolutely believe that everywhere else, were not at all believing that an art market can be fastly established. There was a big success of the 80s artists in the 80s already, mostly abroad, but after the 90s, the success of the 80s, the new wild painting have faded away very fast, and then there was a kind of a big vacuum in which nobody, in which it was also a problem how to support the artwork, to realize it for an exhibition. And in that sense, there was we have to underline that there was one very important foundation, the Soros Foundation, which became very active in Hungary, and also established later an organization which was called C3, Center for Communication, which supported the production and exhibiting of new media artwork, new media works. And that somehow speeded up a little bit of the development of the art from one side, but it had no any impact on the market. And it is very interesting that now, as I told you before our conversation, that we are now just organizing an exhibition of the 90s here in the Hungarian National Gallery, that many of the artworks what we exhibit are very badly made. And one of the very primary reasons why they are so weakly made is that nobody was thinking that ever it could be part of any kind of collection. The target was to exhibit them. And what will happen after the exhibition, nobody cared. But from the state side, the awakening of the need of the support of the arts was rather early, because in the 90s we had a new foundation which is called National Cultural Fund. And this National Cultural Fund has different, still working, and it had different section for dance, section for supporting publishing literature, section of design, photography, and fine art as well. And what was interesting in this organization that this is using a tax money, and there's a rather wide call for applications, an application for production, and there's an application also for realizing, or was in the 90s, to realize exhibitions. And this fund became very, very important, very crucial. I think that this became an institution behind the institutions. And if in our further discussion we are speaking of any of this question what you had, what we were not touching yet, if there were any interesting new aspects of establishing institutions. So the National Cultural Fund was the base why new initiatives could be formed. So that's my overview about the economic system of the 90s.
Thank you for this valuable contribution. And I think I can just let the discussion flow by itself now. Dorota is raising a hand. And also, I will soon open the floor for everyone who is here in the chat room. So if you have any questions or comments, please prepare them.
I would like to concentrate on this art market at Wocem to Żolt, because in Poland the same. I mean, the material aspect of the artworks which were created in those times was very weak, and we fight for preserving them for the next generations, because there was no art market, so nobody cared that it has to be sold, and as you said, and it needs to have a shape which can protect it and let it survive. I don't remember that. Remembering is not the best way of discussing the subject, but I don't remember that to have any special investors in the 90s for the contemporary art, which was quite rebellious. So in general, who wanted to have naked women in those times on the wall, yeah, and so on and so on. And as you probably know, the contemporary art in those times was really a big fighter and obscenic, let's say. So it was not a good for collecting. It was rather like in Slovakia, means that the people were buying artworks of the 19th century. These famous Cossacks in Poland, they are famous, the family Cossack, paintings with horses and soldiers and or landscapes, or at least symbolic art nouveau of the turn of the centuries, 19 to 20. So this is about art market. In Poland, the art market started only in 21st century with a boom for Polish artists like Sasna and others. Yeah, so it was 2003 or 2004. And young entrepreneurs, they did not want to buy young Polish art. They were buying Cossacks, yeah, Marczewski. These are the names of the 19th century art history. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Would Omar and Barbara like to? I see that, yes. Some comments on the art market.
I just want to add to what Zsolt said, because the Soros Foundation was very important in Slovakia in the 90s. Actually, it was the institution that in the mid-90s was supporting progressive contemporary art, and also helped some artists to get visible internationally, like Roman Ondak, for example. But as Zsolt said, that they didn't have and the Soros foundations or the Open Society Foundation and these institutions operated also in the Czech Republic, in Romania, I think, and also and not in Poland, I think. But yeah, anyway, so maybe Barbara can add to it. But what is interesting is that Zsolt said they didn't have any influence on the art market, but in Slovakia actually they did somehow, because the Soros Foundation later developed to the so-called Foundation Center for Contemporary Art, which is an institution that still exists today, but it's transformed from this Soros Foundation in the late 90s, beginning of 2000s, to this new institution. And this new institution started to make auctions, because in the 90s there was only one auction house in Slovakia, which was oriented mostly on modernism, on the first half of the 20th century, on the Slovak modernism, which was for all the new rich people something that you have to have. But this Center for Contemporary Art, this foundation, started also with Sotheby's auctions of contemporary young art. And this was I think the first auction was in 2003. So this was like a breaking point for the art market and the contemporary young, or at that time the young art, or the art from the 90s, or the artists that came to the scene in the 90s, that they also started to be present on the art market. And this creation of this private or actually not private, but auction that wasn't really run by an auction house like Christie's or Sotheby's, but this was auctions run by non-governmental civic association supporting arts, because the money that they got from the auctions, they invested in supporting arts. So this was a very good model, that this money went to supporting exhibitions of artists, and this situation caused other small auction houses, or actually not houses but auction initiatives, to grow in Slovakia in the beginning of in the whole first decade of 2000s. We had like 3 or 4 private initiatives that annually made like 2, maybe 3 auctions of contemporary art, which is really interesting. That nowadays all of them just left this. They don't do this anymore because I think economically is what it was not feasible. But this is interesting that you didn't have really these institutional background in these traditional auction houses or in this traditional art market, but it was rather done in this kind of independent way. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add also.
Thank you. I give way to Barbara, and then I see Dorota also wants to add something.
Yeah, also, if Dorota want to react to Omar, I can give her space because I wanted to make a more general remark, I guess.
Then
Okay.
Dorota, would you like to join?
I would like to change a little bit the field of the discussion because I wanted to go to the NGOs now. I think we saw we said everything about art market for the moment as an institution. So Barbara, if you want to be first, just take the floor, please.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try something and we'll see how it's going to work. What I found quite interesting is also Soros' position in Czech Republic. But what I wanted to mention is not the auction houses and the market and so on, because I think it established somehow in the 90s, but it actually, as Dorota said, started to really, let's say, being a power in the beginning of new millennia. But what I was interested in is this kind of position of Soros in the context of public space and so on. When you mentioned democracy and liberalism was also the word which was mentioned before. It's something very important here, right? And the manual which Soros brought into Central Europe, into Czech Republic, was very important, I guess. From this context, the gallery Jelení, for example, which is very, very important in 90s and the beginning of the new millennium, was established somehow. So this is again the position for a new generation which comes in the beginning of 90s, not before, not from the later, not from the previous decades. I'm sorry for that. The other thing I was very much interested, or I would be very much interested in, is position of different media. Because I think what really happened in Czech Republic was interest in post-conceptual art, in video art. And this is very important in connection with curators, because Ševčík, for example, became quite a figure here in a position or some sort of difference in position with, for example, Chalupecký from previous decade. I don't know if you know this kind of connection, splendid isolation, but this is something which really operated in Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, before 1989. And it was the reason why the Czech unofficial scene was so, differentiated towards political system or politics as such. And this is something which really changed in during the 90s, also in this kind of generational shift. And I think it was very much, or it is still very important in reflecting the whole situation of the 90s. And this kind of shift between media, like video art on one hand, post-conceptual art on the same hand, actually. On the other hand, painting as very, very problematic media in the 90s. This is something which really makes a strong case also for financing, I think, and working inside the institution or market spaces as well. So this is it from me. Thank you.
So I give way to Dorota, and then if you have any questions, our dear companions, please, this will be the moment to ask them.
Barbara, it's great what you said about Soros, because it comes together with I wanted to say. Recently I read a book by Karolina Łabowicz, which is about the network of Soros Institutes. It is in Polish, unfortunately. I gave it in the chat, the bibliography. And I read from this book with a big astonishment that the situation that the artists abandoned painting and started to work in different media. It is thanks to Soros model of institution. And I would not agree with this, because in Poland, Soros I would totally not agree with this thesis. I had no opportunity to discuss with the author of the book because I've just read it recently. Because in Poland the Soros Center was only working for 2 years. Yeah, it was a very weak. It was at last a weak institution and acted short and quickly was closed, let's say. But of course, the idea of open society was very vivid in Poland in the 90s, thanks to Piotr Piotrowski, and because of the circumstances. It means we were living the not American sector, but we were living the totalitarian society, and we are trying to create a democracy. Yeah, as in I think in every country in this region. Yeah, every post-communist country. So the idea of open society was very vivid. So I think that from my point of view, this multimedia art of the 90s were resulted by more because of the fight which was run by the artists against for the open society. It was easier to make narrative using video work than painting, because these were very serious problems and they needed very radical reaction. I would stand with this old-fashioned interpretation, because now the new-fashioned interpretation is that it was thanks to Soros. So I cannot agree, at least in Poland. And I was thinking, because Arek wrote to us about the NGOs. What were the NGOs in the beginning of the 90s? And I made a list that there was Kultur Kontakt, Pro Helvetia, Erste Bank, and I have to say that these institutions were not very much interested in art from Poland. I mean, this is the Middle Europa idea. All of them were active in Vienna, and Poland was this a very short part of the country belonged to the Habsburg monarchy. So we were not very lucky with these institutions. I cannot say that they did not support Polish art at all, but we are always at the last place, on the last place in the queue for money. That's what I recall. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel that some questions that appeared in the beginning have reappeared throughout the whole discussion, and a tension has built, so to speak, that now maybe requires a change of dynamic. Are there any comments or questions to what has already been said on this floor? Well, I don't see anyone. I guess we could keep the conversation flowing all by itself, but I will maybe add one question that, again, enlarges our perspective, but in a rather specific way. I would like us to leave the 90s for a while, because I guess from the external perspective, one factor that frames this narrative I mentioned in the very beginning, that determines it, an important factor in how people from the outside might look at the Polish or the Slovakian or Hungarian or Czech transformation as a process of, yes, modernization, and a successful one, is the institutional boom, you could say, of the early 21st century, which is maybe the prime reason why some conflicts of values and institutional conflicts from the 1990s are blurred in the public memory right now. We prefer to remember about the successes and not about the sometimes difficult ways that have led to these successful moments. So my question to you would be, how, from today's perspective, what is your feeling about the cultural conflicts that defined the institutional and artistic transformations of the 1990s. Is this a closed chapter, or are these conflicts and tensions something that we also experience and maybe relive until today? I would risk an affirmative answer with respect to Poland nowadays, but I won't say anything for now, and maybe I will give way to Barbara.
Okay. How to answer it? I think actually that the transformation period hasn't stopped yet. I think that the interest in the contemporary art in 90s somehow stopped the interest in institutions themselves. I mean, the institutions are too much, I mean, in Czech Republic, but it might be similar also in other countries, I don't know. Might be too interested in themselves and not so much in their social or political position in the space. Also, I think that this kind of criticism of institutions and actually the whole system in Czech Republic or in Central Europe is something which still prevails over the the position of the institution itself. When I use the word build something or do something or establish the institution in our context, it's very, very problematic. And I don't get any appreciation for that because we are still in a period of the construction of the institutions, I think, somehow. One experience which is very strong and very new, I was on a board or a commission which selected artists for a Venice Biennial for the next year. And one thing which somehow, it's not shocking, but it's just sad, which surprised me is that, like, let's say only 20 or 25 artists or group of artists applied to be part of the Venice Biennial. And it was very, the scene is so somehow closed into itself, dealing with problems which are really local, dealing with them in a direction which is really, again, very restrictive, not so open. And the openness itself, or the whole concept of open society, is actually some sort of a problematic issue, which is very ideological right now. The whole scene is very problematic, and I think it starts from the institutions toward artistic scene. So if I should close this kind of blabbing on my side, I would say that transformation hasn't been finished. It still is ongoing process, which has very many issues which are still not answered properly. And if we would like to, or I would like to do something really with this kind of issue, I would start from the institution and thinking about the institution, how it should work in the society. I don't want to be too idealistic, but I like one American philosopher, and actually I quote him all the time. And it's Alvano, and he thinks about art in this kind of a pragmatic tradition, right? As some sort of a strange tool or a specific tool we can use for ourselves. Or we actually developed for ourselves to reconstruct our thinking about ourselves. So this would be the position or the impulse I would like to give myself every morning when I wake up and go to work into my institution, thinking about the museum, how it should work for the society. So again, the transformation hasn't ended. It's still something which is ongoing, and we have to deal with it, I guess, for myself. Thank you very much.
In light of what you just said, it's difficult to answer the question that Anna Mituś just added to our chat, asking, is there something like a turning point, a moment when the incorporation of the former East into the former West happened? If the transformation is still ongoing, you could say this shift is also stretched in time, or this incorporation. But this is a question you could also maybe consider now while adding some comments and responses. I saw that John was raising his hand.
Yeah, can I just answer very quickly from my perspective and
Absolutely.
then give floor to everybody, and I'll be quiet. But I think this is, again, a generational shift, but it doesn't have to be just about that. But I would say that for now, we don't have to think from the position of East about the West issues and so on. We just have to think about ourselves in our context, right? And reestablish the position somehow. It's not anymore about a stabilization or something like that of the Central European context or a local context and so on. It's about a coherent discussion in between different spaces. When you said about decolonization before the discussion started, actually, I think it's very strong impulse. It would be just very, very quick remark from me.
Zsolt, I give way.
Thank you. So it was very interesting what Barbora told about the unfinishment of the changing processes, what I absolutely underline as the curator of the Hungarian National Gallery. We also experienced that it's not just about the role of the museum or role of the institution in the society, but we experience very roughly the change of the audiences. We experience very much that there is a new generation coming up with less and less information about visual arts, so there is no any background to rely on from one side, and on the other side there is, happily or not so happily, but we have a lot of tourists coming into our institutions which do not have back informations about different artistic trends or whatever. They just want to spend time or to amuse themselves or to use the services of the museum. And so that kind of intellectual institution, what we were running and what we were working in the 90s or in the 80s, just do not exist anymore. Even if we still would like to keep in our minds how good it was to discuss art on certain level, but from now on we just have to change our minds to be a kind of an educator or presenter or whatever. So it's a totally different role, and in that sense I also think that these changes have not been settled, but the reason is not just because of the uncloseness of the political changes. The times are also changing, and answering to this question, if the incorporation of the former East into the former West happened, it did not, I think so. But in the terms of the art market in Hungary, when the first wave of the private galleries focusing on contemporary art have settled, and some of the galleries, like 7, 8, not much more, had been stronger in the beginning of 2000, 2005, or something like that, that I would name as a term of the art market. And also it was also related to that fact that the people who we are speaking about who were investing in classical art, they became satisfied with their investment, and they felt that they got a position because of owning art. And from that moment, from the turn of the millennium, they said, well, fine, I don't invest anymore to classical art, which gave me a profit in 5 years. But from now on, I try to invest to contemporary art, which will give a profit to my kids. And that created first a smaller group of collectors, which became slowly, very slowly, bigger and bigger. Thank you.
Omar, would you like to comment on the long duration of the 90s, so to speak?
As Barbora said, that the process is still going on, the transformation and the construction of the institutions. Well, in Slovakia, I think the transformation and the process hasn't even begun yet, because if you just imagine that there was not a single cultural building constructed in Slovakia after 1998, not a museum, not a gallery, not a philharmonic, nothing. We have only old buildings that are being renovated, or even if renovated, like the Slovak National Gallery. It was the iconic, because it consists of two buildings. and the iconic building from the 1970s was closed since 2001. It has been reconstructed for 7 years, and it just opened recently in October, and is still not in full function yet. So this is the situation. The National Theatre in Bratislava, it had been constructed for 27 years. It began in the 80s and finished in 2007, I think. So this is the situation, that there's from the state's point of view, culture is at the very end of on the list, on the to-do list, which is very sad. But I remain optimistic. That's why I still work in this field of culture and art. What's happening since the 2010s, like in the last decade, is the really big rise of the independent cultural sector and independent culture centers, actually. And in many different cities or smaller towns in Slovakia. So not only the big ones like Bratislava, Košice, and so on, but also in small regional towns where people really have this enthusiasm and energy to develop something. They may be studied abroad and return to their hometown and establish an independent cultural space. And also the creation of the Slovak Arts Council in 2015 helped this situation a lot, that they now can apply for funding because otherwise they couldn't exist and couldn't make any program. But this is, I think, I hope this is I think that also the state institutions should learn, like, to have more enthusiasm and more energy. Of course, the people who work at the state institutions or the regional institutions have to have enthusiasm, otherwise they wouldn't work there. But anyway, I think this is the energy that we have to keep on focusing at, because the big institutions is just I don't know if this is something that will happen in 20, 30, 50 years, that we finally have some new building, a new opera house designed by International Architectural Bureau or something. I don't know. We even don't have new hospitals and nothing. So I don't know. I think it's more falling apart than being constructed, unfortunately.
Barbara just added on the chat that the Central European Forum in Olomouc, for which she works, will be opening the first building built in the Czech Republic for the arts in over 100 years, into 2028. Construction starts next year. Well, I would say that's an optimistic perspective. And Dorota, would you like to drop some optimistic remarks from our perspective?
Listening to you, I didn't want to speak because I think I will change the climate of these speeches, because I think that in Poland the transformation is absolutely over. First of all, because there was a revival of leftist thinking. Leftist thinking became legitimate again in Poland after 2000. That is the first factor, and the second, that the liberal politics has been criticized very widely, and there is no comeback to this liberal economy, this wild liberal economy, which was in the 90s in Poland. Of course, we have other problems, but this is not about transformation. We have the populistic problems, as in many countries in the world now, but it is not the transformation. And concerning the institutional system, I think that it is not because of transformation, the political problems we have now. No more. But what concerns the art institution system, I think that our system is already developed in the more or less final shape. I mean, after when we joined the European Union, we have a program for creating new museums of contemporary art. So museums were created, and 4 new museums were created, and of course not every museum has got a new building, but in fact from the European money, Poland built a museum in Toruń, in Krakow, and we are at the there's more complicated about financing, but also in Warsaw next year we will open the Museum of Modern Art. So the infrastructure is, I mean, the hard infrastructure is quite ready. Now the problem will be to finance the activities of these museums. This will be a problem. And what else? More problems now because of this political situation in Poland. Also, there's a kind of decentralization because now again, like in the 80s, some artists don't want to exhibit in Zachęta National Gallery, in CCA in Warsaw, in Zamek Ujazdowski, and also in Museum of Art in Łódź, and then all we look for the exhibiting spaces outside Warsaw. And now they gain more importance, the galleries in such cities like Tarnów, Sopot, Kalisz, Bydgoszcz, the places which used to be understood as secondary in comparison with the galleries in the capital city in Warsaw. But now there is such a, and I see Romuald Bochiński, so he in discussion, so also in Radom it's a very important gallery. So this is now I say that this hard infrastructure, museums are already ready mostly, but the focus is outside Warsaw now. So it is a forced decentralization, I can say.
And I think, Dorota, that you provided a beautiful compositional clasp to our discussion, because we started from the question about the infrastructure from the communist or real socialist times being reinvented and adapted. And many of these smaller institutions that you just mentioned are exactly the institutions that have remained as the bureaus of artistic exhibitions from the communist times, from the regional network of art spaces. And I think this is the right moment to finish, and it is an open ending. I actually, to insert yet another tension, agree with Barbara that even in Poland, the transformation has not yet ended, or it at least has long durational effects that are still very much felt. I hope that we at least conveyed some information about the institutional changes after 1989 to the wider public in a situated, localized manner, which might become helpful in further research and curatorial projects. And I thank all of you. Thanks to AICA Hungary for organizing this particular roundtable. Thank you to AICA International for hosting us. And once again to Visegrad Fund for financing the grant project. And welcome everyone. I invite you now to the 55th Congress of AICA International, which will take place between the 13th and 18th of November in Kraków, Poland. And this will be a lovely opportunity to actually see the Visegrad anthology and perhaps discuss today's subject matters in depth yet again. Once again, thank you all and see you next time.